Hi everyone, my name is Audrey McSain and I'm the Sustainability Program Manager here at Lehigh University. And on behalf of the Office of Sustainability, in collaboration with the Environmental Initiative, Environmental Studies Program, and the Lehigh Sustainability Council, we would like to first extend our well wishes and for health and well-being to all of you and your loved ones during this challenging and unprecedented time. As we've all scrambled to adjust to a new normal, we're really thrilled that we are able to connect here today to celebrate Earth Month. So just to give you an idea of the format of this event, we will have a 40-minute talk followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. Please use the chat feature to ask questions, and my colleague Al Bodson will moderate the session later on. So 50 years ago today, the very first Earth Day marked the birth of the modern environmental movement. And this year, the international theme of Earth Day is climate action. And I can only say just how immensely fitting it is to have Joseph Robertson, Global Strategy Director of Citizens Climate Education, as our Earth Day speaker today. For those of you that may be a little bit less familiar with the Citizens Climate Education, it is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization whose mission it is to educate the public, media, volunteers, and members of Congress on climate change solutions. The sister organization to this Citizens Climate Education is the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots advocacy organization focused on national policies to address climate change. I had the pleasure of working with Joseph when I was an undergrad at Moravian College, just as the Sustainable Development Goals were released and world leaders were congregating in France to create the Paris Agreement. And I'm really thrilled to be able to reconnect and have him with us all today. Joseph is Global Strategy Director for Citizens Climate Education. He is the lead strategist supporting the Acceleration Dialogues, the Engage for Climate Civic Engagement Network, and the Resilience Intel Climate Smart Finance Initiative. In this role, he represents Citizens Climate Education and a network of 196,000 Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers from 57 countries in the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations, and other United Nations processes. As of April 2020, Joseph is also serving as the head of the Secretariat for a new Food System Economics Commission. He is the founder of Geoversive and editorial director of Earth Intelligence, a startup news service, convening space, and podcast covering the state of humanity's relationship to Earth systems and the related landscape of economic and technical innovation. With that, I'm honored to introduce Joseph Robertson.
Thank you, Audrey. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and I'd just like to second what Audrey said. I hope everybody is staying safe and that everyone you care about is well. I'm going to pull up some slides in a minute, but I just wanted to say that quick hello. So we're 50 years from the first Earth Day, and we're in a very strange time. It's a test that seems unprecedented, but it's not entirely unprecedented. We've had global tests before, we've had pandemics before, we've had things that have disrupted civilization as it was known at the time. In fact, there's a book called Catastrophe that goes back to the 4th and 5th centuries that looks at how a combination of pandemic and climate disruption radically altered the course of future history. And we're all, in some ways, beneficiaries of those changes. Changes are going to come whether we make them happen or not. And the most important thing, I think, is that we be deliberate about how we make these changes. We could accidentally stumble our way into a better world, but too slowly. We could accidentally stumble our way into a world that is far worse off than the one we're starting out with. And we could also plan our way into a world where everybody has a chance at real human dignity, prosperity, and thriving. So I'm going to start this talk about integrative geopolitics, climate resilience in a post-COVID world by simply saying this one thing that's right there on the screen in front of you. Health, climate, food, democracy, and all the riches in the world depend on what we do. I think it's important for us to think about that. We're seeing right now how quickly massive wealth and power can be disrupted. That's partly because we haven't designed the systems that we live in and that we live on to serve us in times of crisis. We've designed them to sort of live moment to moment, day to day, and far too many people around the world live hand to mouth or week to week without a lot of cushion. We've been treating the earth that way as well. So a quick note about what you see on the screen there. If we go back to a few years before the first Earth Day, 4 years before the famous Earthrise photo was taken by the crew of Apollo 8 as it rounded the moon, the World's Fair was hosted in New York City. And in the center of it was what is still today the world's largest globe called the Unisphere. That's what you see on the screen. There are 3 metal arcs around it. Those 3 metal arcs trace the orbits followed by the first Soviet cosmonaut, the first American astronaut in space, and the first telecommunication satellite to orbit the Earth, each of them. So the Unisphere was meant to represent in some ways the theme of the fair itself. The theme was peace through understanding. And the Unisphere was dedicated to humanity's achievements on a shrinking globe in an expanding universe. It was recognition that science was showing that our universe is far bigger than we had previously thought it to be. And that meant our place in the universe was increasingly small and far from the center, wherever that might be. So it's meant to symbolize humility, but it's also meant to symbolize knowledge and interconnection. Part of the vision for that fair and what the Unisphere is meant to represent is that we are closer together than we have ever been, and we are interdependent. Since the 1960s, when it was clear that the world needed to develop an international system that would be able to prevent the kind of catastrophic wars that had happened already twice in the century and looked like they might be about to emerge again with what became known as the Cold War. The building of that international system, the allowance for collaboration among nations to solve major problems was considered crucial, and it was considered to be aligned with science, democracy, and with the road to better conditions for all people everywhere. That optimistic approach for some people was ambitious at the time. Some people think it's ambitious now. The reality is that I think to understand the moment we're in, we have to think about what optimism means. Optimism means aiming for the optimal outcome. If the best possible outcome within the realm of the possible is possible, then logically one should aim for it. If it becomes impossible, if that best possible outcome that used to be possible yesterday is no longer possible and things have shifted, then we again should aim for the optimum. That is optimism. It's not an irrational thing. It's how we put people in space. It's how we send probes to Jupiter and Saturn and out beyond the edges of the solar system. And this moment that the Unisphere was meant to represent includes all of that thinking as a kind of embedded culture. I want to move from that moment to where we are now. And so I'm going to shift to this scene from Google Earth. You can see the Unisphere in the middle of this image. And what you see is a place called Corona Park. It's in the middle of Flushing Meadow, Queens. It's where the USTA Tennis Center is. You may notice a lot of things there are temporarily closed due to the pandemic. It turns out that this place, which just happens to have that name, Corona Park, is in the middle of one of the worst affected areas in the world by this pandemic. That's not a small thing. The tennis center you see there has been converted into a field hospital. The hospitals in the area are being overwhelmed. And it just turns out that for context, you know, the message of that inspirational globe is coming through loud and clear. We are closer together than we have ever been. And that's how we find ourselves in this situation. We need to figure out how to manage that closeness. Now, here you see the Unisphere in the upper right. And then in the lower left, you see New York City Health Elmhurst Hospital. That is one of the places that has suffered the most, where people have, where we've seen what happens when the healthcare system is overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the challenge. A lot of people have died. The very brave people working there in what has been called the epicenter of the epicenter, I think are, for many people, being celebrated as courageous people risking their lives to help others, doing things that the rest of us think of as unthinkable, doing their jobs in the midst of a crisis. Ultimately, what we're living through right now is the most widespread disruption of everyday life most human beings alive can remember. I'm going to move forward now to some very important scientific information. This is from the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Information Center. They are tracking all of the known confirmed cases, as well as total number of deaths, and also now they're tracking testing in the United States. Unfortunately, this image is from yesterday, so the numbers have increased quite a bit. There are now 2,611,182 people infected, confirmed to have been infected. The number of total deaths has increased by 5,163 to 180,784. As of 1:39 p.m. Eastern Time today, 14,887 people have died in New York City alone. Based on these numbers, the global numbers, what we know is that 6.923% of people confirmed to have the infection have died. That means nearly 7 out of every 100 people. So it is very hard to overstate how serious this is. No person who has not been infected and recovered has any immunity to this pathogen. And so that is why, for the first time in history, all 50 United States are under disaster declarations at the same time. There are ways in which this is a natural disaster, and there may be ways when we learn more about how everything happened in which it was also a human-caused disaster. But the most important thing is that we have science and information to guide us. And I think one of the great lessons of this crisis, it was articulated recently by an epidemiologist who said on NPR that, you know, fear is often based on sudden surprise of lethal danger. Now, when you combine those things, fear escalates quickly. But if you can reduce the surprise factor, then you can trigger all of the things in people that allow them to plan better and to be safer. And immediately the fear response goes down. And so information is our friend. And I think that's the most important thing for us to focus on this Earth Day. Information is our friend. If we think about what's happened because we have to find a way to stop the spread, we're seeing cities emptied. You see there some public transit that's still moving. That's happening in a lot of places. There are people who have essential jobs. There are people who need to get somewhere to help others, to make sure services are running, or even just to make sure we have food. 300 million Americans are currently under lockdown or stay-at-home orders. These are words that I think just a few weeks ago, most of us would have never been able to imagine saying. And yet it's urgently needed. In the 4 weeks that ended on April 11th, 22 million Americans filed for unemployment insurance. That's many more times any previous record in any circumstance. And because of how unemployment insurance works, those numbers are most likely a gross understatement of the actual number of people who now have less income or no income. All of this is to say that what we're learning from the ramifications of doing what we know we need to do to keep people safe is that many of the core structures of what we call the economy are not well suited to deal with major disruptions. And they're in fact not well suited to deal with human need. because that's ultimately what's happening is we have human need clashing with the needs of the economy, which I think too often stands in for human need. The idea that the economy gets better does not mean that every single person in that place has a better life. And that's something we need to start figuring out, because some of these negative consequences, what economists will call inefficiencies, are worse than inefficiencies. They are extreme dangers. We now are seeing very real concerns that the 21st century will experience major crop failures in multiple breadbasket regions simultaneously, not from climate disruption, but from the ripple effect of the COVID-19 emergency, the closing of borders, the closing of trade, shutting down and disruption of supply chains. What that partly means is that those supply chains are not designed optimally to keep us alive. We're even seeing that bees' ability to get to where they're going is being disrupted, because so many regions where we grow food, where hundreds of millions of people depend on food coming from those regions, cannot sustain wildflower populations and pollinator populations, that we have to actually ship bees to them by truck, by train, by airplane. And so because travel is restricted, bees travel is also restricted. And that means in many places, food production is going to start slowing down. Again, let's think about what this means. It's not that the disruption is causing the negative outcome, it's that the design made it so that when we needed to do this thing to keep ourselves safe, we would end up having these problems. The design is what we need to fix. I'd just like to say at this moment that if we keep in mind that information is our friend, we have to also keep in mind that it doesn't make sense for people to be saying we shouldn't be following the science, that we should be taking risks, or that there's some kind of trade-off we can make where if a few more people die, it's not a big deal because the economy can do better. First of all, that doesn't make sense. The economy logically will not do better in those circumstances, but the trade-off logic itself is dangerous. It's obvious that we cannot afford to allow an infection that kills 7% of those infected to keep spreading. There's no way in which that could ever be affordable. But that trade-off logic that we hear people using, which they use to say, for instance, now is not the time to talk about sustainability, now is not the time to talk about climate resilience or clean energy or those kind of things. That terrifying trade-off logic has been used for a very long time to try to stop us from doing the right thing. Incumbent industries that benefit from what is effectively a right to pollute, they always argue that their own operating efficiencies are the best situation the world could ever know, and that if we do anything to change that situation, we'll all be worse off. That's the argument they make, but it doesn't hold up anymore. And I think we're starting to see how clear that is. The industrial systems that have been designed to create efficiencies for the few are undermining our ability to respond to crisis. And we could look at the COVID-19 crisis as the first of many planetary scale disruptions that we may experience in this century, that we are likely to experience according to what science tells us. Going back to the 1960s for a moment, this satellite dish that you can see on your screen is at a place called Camp Evans, New Jersey. It's now a museum called the Info Age Science Museum. But it was a US Army base where the US Army Signal Corps was based throughout most of the 20th century. And in 1961, this dish tracked the first weather satellites monitoring conditions on Earth from space. Since that time, we've now developed the ability to monitor Earth systems in high resolution. We monitor the Earth from all kinds of orbiting bodies, including satellites and also an international space station manned by human beings from around the world. We can monitor not only the actual physical view of the Earth, we can track wind speeds and weather patterns in real time. We can track temperatures monitored on the ground, mapped to what we see from space, geolocated with GPS capabilities, and traced through time so we can see Earth systems moving and understand why did the fluid dynamics that we're seeing do what they do. That is part of the way the Earth works, and we're starting to understand it better than we ever did before. Now, what you're looking at the moment is a global map of the highest temperature on a given day earlier this week, everywhere in the world. And you can see quite a few regions that are off the charts. You can see some places in the Arctic that are comfortably cool, as they should be. What we can also see from these kind of maps is the times when all of that is not how it should be. So many of you have heard of the polar vortex, for instance. This is not a map of weather patterns. This is a map of temperature, but the polar vortex is essentially a wind system that whips around the Arctic and keeps the colder temperatures further north and separates that climate system from the warmer temperatures further south. So if you imagine the purple region at the top of your globe there, starting to bleed down across the Great Plains of North America, that is what we mean when we say there's a polar vortex, because the actual wind pattern has slipped out of its circular loop around the Arctic and brought Arctic air down. That has to do with not only wind speed, but it has to do with temperature differentials, pressure differentials, and all kinds of things. We're monitoring all of those things now. They tell us a lot about our everyday life. I just want to take a moment to recognize the importance of this image. This is the warming stripes visualization that was created by Ed Hawkins, a climate scientist, using climate data from multiple sources. It shows the warming trend across the world from 1850 to the present. And what it does to show that warming trend is just to show the average temperature throughout the year for each of those years. And so you see a very clear trend from colder to warmer across the world. If you go to showyourstripes.info, you can actually look up the stripes for your area. Some places have a much more chaotic pattern than others, but I think it's interesting to try to know your stripes, know your place, and let people know that you know about it. I think it gives us a different perspective on how quickly things are changing. Now, again, on the subject of knowledge being our friend, we have put a lot of satellites in space. And we've put a lot of satellites there that are specifically Earth observing satellites. You see many of them there which are labeled. You see one that is not exactly labeled, which is the largest one, which has those 16 large solar arms coming off of it. That's the International Space Station. We actually have people on that space station also looking at the Earth and studying it, using instruments, doing science. I'm not going to go into all the detail of what each of these satellites does, but consider that each of them has a different mission. One is monitoring cloud cover. One is monitoring changes to land area. One is monitoring forest cover. Another is monitoring CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. We're getting to a point where you cannot hide what you're doing to planetary systems. And I'm not going to say that that is the thing that caused this major crash in oil markets to happen this week. It's not the thing that caused that to happen. A decline in demand because people are not using fuel has caused the price of oil to dip below zero for the first time in history, meaning that now, this week, it became necessary to pay people to take oil off your hands because nobody wanted it and there was nowhere to store it and you can't sell it. Now, that has to do with how the markets are structured. It doesn't have to do with these satellites. It's not because you can't hide pollution, but it is a sign of something. It is a sign of a design that is flawed. And a very simple back of the envelope calculation would tell you that electricity would not become worthless overnight because people stop moving around. We're using it right now to connect with each other. We're moving into an age when information and electricity are much more the bloodstream of our civilization than combustible fuels. That's just part of where we are and where we're going. And I think it should be something we think about as we try to come out of this. Now, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, has a system of satellites called GOES, G-O-E-S, and they take very high resolution photographs of specific regions. So they stay over that same region, they're geostationary satellites, and they monitor constantly what's happening there. That's how you get that high resolution image. If you look at this image, which was taken yesterday afternoon, right in the center of that image is essentially cloud cover over open ocean, which is south of Delaware and east of the Virginia coast. And if you go straight north from that center of the picture, where you eventually end up is the Lehigh Valley. So what was going on in Lehigh, Pennsylvania yesterday around this time is on your screen right now. And if you go to NASA or NOAA's websites and look for the GOES satellite imagery, you can find what's happening right now on Earth through this satellite system. This is for perspective, because this image is another GOES image from NOAA, and it's a historic photograph. This captures a moment in the history of our civilization and in the history of our planet, unlike any other. According to what we know about recorded history, this was the first time that 3 tropical cyclones made landfall at the same time in the North Atlantic Caribbean region. In the center, you see the first one that emerged of these 3, which is Hurricane Irma. On the left side, just west of the Yucatan Peninsula, making landfall in Mexico, very bundled up and without a clearly defined eye, you see Hurricane Katia, which was itself a very large storm, but not as well known as the others from that year. And then on the far right, you see Hurricane Maria, which grew into a much bigger and more devastating storm. And these were 3 of the 5 major tropical cyclones that ripped through that same, essentially, alley of wind and weather during that hurricane season. The first of them was Harvey, which devastated Houston. Now, why is it important to take note of the historic importance of that image? Because things are changing. And we've talked for a long time about how hurricanes will get stronger, storms will get stronger. And I think a lot of us have thought about that as some distant future point. But what we're learning as we start to see the planet changing because climate is being disrupted so seriously is that some of these signals, like bigger, stronger storms, are happening sooner. Other things are going to be more subtle and they're going to take more time to emerge. Some of those things that could fundamentally undermine ecosystems, biodiversity, or the arability of land, the ability to farm land in certain regions, or even the water supply to entire regions if mountain glaciers disappear, for instance. Some of these things, when they eventually come, will be far too big for us to understand in our current context, just like the COVID-19 pandemic is too big for us to have understood just a few months ago. Now, in the upper right of your screen, you see a visualization that is not from NOAA, but that seeks to tell us a little bit about what we know about some of those hidden risks that are building up in the background. This is where those images come from. It's called the Weave Network Graph. It's a visualization that's part of a project that we've created in our international work at Citizens Climate called Resilience Intel. And the goal of the Resilience Intel initiative is to try to figure out how we can build science insights into financial decision-making. Not build it in by teaching everybody about science, but build the actual science insights into the financial data flows so that financial decision makers are more likely to make scientifically informed choices, more sustainable choices. Now, the Weave Network Graph is what you call a global knowledge graph using the GDELT analysis service. That global knowledge graph maps knowledge connections, meaning places where we know that certain things have occurred next to each other in published literature or in reporting on events in the world. Specifically, this one is looking at water, climate, biodiversity resilience mapped to agriculture, food, finance, energy, infrastructure, science, shipping, watersheds, ocean health, forestry, and land use practices. All of that is bundled into that big green bird's nest. Now, On the left side, you see the entire graph, the WEAVE graph, which stands for Whole Earth Active Value Economy. On the right, you see 8 smaller visualizations that represent individual entities. Now, you can see on the far right, you see 1, 2, 3, 4 going down. The left of those 8, the top is very faint, and that's because that first one on the top, which looks a little bit like a shark fin, there are only 4 points in that graph. That's how limited the knowledge in relation to those areas in recurring published information is for that entity. That entity is a large industrial food production company, which I won't name. Now, right below it, that thing that looks kind of like a strange fish, the second one out of on the left side of those 8, that one is the United States Supreme Court. Now, just ask yourself, if you're a leading industrial company, do you want to be that far behind the United States Supreme Court in issues of such consequence? I would say that's a bad place to be. And so just from the visualization, you start to see who is prepared and who is not prepared for a future in which these things are being disrupted. Right below the Supreme Court there, that bright blue one, that's the European Commission. They're clearly doing more, saying more, interacting more on all of this. And I'll just highlight one more for a brief moment. The second one from the top on the right, that green sort of starburst, that's the United States. And what that shows us is a couple of things. One thing it shows us is a lot of knowledge flows through the United States in all directions, on all different levels of environmental responsibility. A lot of science comes from here. It also shows how much what happens here affects the rest of the world, because that's where those things are going out to. They're going out to those planetary systems that affect the rest of the world. So this is a little bit of an experiment with trying to visualize how we can trace knowledge about this resilient future we need to build and how close we're getting. It's also important to show that it is this complex. The complexity is one of the challenges, and so we have to be clear about that. Now, Audrey mentioned at the beginning the Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed at the United Nations headquarters during the General Assembly in 2015. 193 nations made an international agreement that they would work on all 17 of these goals simultaneously within their borders and also in collaboration with each other. The goal would be that all people everywhere by the year 2030 would have a real chance of having good outcomes on all 17 of these goals. Some people think having 17 global goals and 169 action targets under those goals makes it very complex. But I think if you compare it to the graph we just looked at, it's clear that this is a very distilled, very useful mapping of the areas of action that we need to get working on so that we can build this more resilient future. Now, people say a lot of things about resilience, and I think one of the things that they say is that it's a choice, that it's something to aspire to. We think about it as if somehow the good behavior involved in being more sustainable or treating the environment well, or legislating in a way that would do that, or investing in a way that would do that. Those are all nice things, but they're those complex, unaffordable do-gooder things. The reality is these are imperatives. They're not just ethical imperatives. They are existential imperatives. And that's sort of the other theme of what we're talking about today. Knowledge is our friend, and we need to use it to confront these ethical imperatives. Because otherwise we face this existential threat. Now, I want to take you into a moment a few years ago, 2 years ago at the COP, which is the Global Climate Negotiations, when it took place in Poland. In this image, where no one is social distancing, so don't take this as guidance. We're not doing this for a while. But this was a plenary session of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Global Negotiations. There were thousands of people in this room from every country in the world. There were many outside observers from organizations like Citizens Climate. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was presenting the findings of its study, which is an overview of all of the science done that relates to this question of how dangerous is it if the world reaches or exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius of total warming across the planet. Everyone sat still and stayed quiet for that entire presentation. And you have to understand that doesn't happen in these sessions. People are coming and going. There are dozens of meetings happening simultaneously. Everybody has somewhere to be. Many people show up just to make one little intervention and then leave. And these are the people who know this. They know how serious this is, and they sat still. And it was an incredibly solemn moment. And I think it was partly in solidarity with each other in this recognition that we have this responsibility to get this right. I like to look at this every once in a while and think about how, in some ways, it's the kind of attention we should all put to the question of whether we are doing our job as crew on Spaceship Earth. It is ultimately up to us. We have to make choices. Now, going ahead to another pre-social distancing image, we're also not doing this year. This was Citizens Climate Lobby's national conference last year. 1,000 citizen volunteer climate advocates on Capitol Hill, talking to over 500 congressional offices in the House and Senate about why we need to build a better climate future. These are people from all different backgrounds, from every state in the country, conservatives and liberals, older, younger people, all there because they believe that government should be listening to the people it serves, not to entities set up to serve some narrower interest. And you'd be surprised if you've never done that kind of thing, how well received that very idea is. The people who are there, regardless of what their voting record is, they generally are there because they do believe that they want to serve. And when people show up and say, that's exactly what we want you to do, it is actually a rewarding experience for everyone. We can't go to the Hill in large numbers like this now, but we can interact with government. And I'd encourage everybody to think about that as a vital activity in service of a livable, sustainable, healthy environmental future. Talk to people in government, talk to local government, talk to state government, talk to the federal government. Try to do it in a way where you're not lecturing people. Talk to people as if they're human beings who want to have a conversation with you, and have one of your goals be that they want to have another one. And if you come with that kind of approach, you may find we can, as a society, take a different course. We can actually play a role in building our future. And I know we're coming up on time here, I think, but I want to run through a few quick points that I think a lot of people don't know. This is a graph of 5 different sectors' shares of the total amount of climate smart finance, or finance committed to invest in climate friendly purposes, as of January of this year. Now, in January of 2019, we had tallied 3.56 trillion in commitments that had been made between 2011 and 2018. And just last year, that number jumped by 71%. We now have over $6 trillion that has been committed. And the interesting thing about these commitments is that the commitments don't disappear simply because a lot of wealth disappeared from the stock market. There are trillions of dollars in wealth have been lost in the stock market. And yet the 6 trillion in commitments is still money that is committed in theory to go to these things. And in some ways, for the entities that have made those commitments, the fact that a greater share of their overall wealth would have to go to those commitments in order to meet the commitment that adds up to 6 trillion is better for them, and it's better for us. We should have a greater and greater share of all the wealth in the world going to practices that are sustainable and build resilience. With trillions of dollars waiting to move, we have to think about what's keeping it from moving. And I think one of the things that's keeping it from moving is a misunderstanding of information. The scientific information that tells us about the resilience of our society and the resilience of natural systems that sustain life is not built into the financial system at all. Some people consider it in different ways, most very loosely and indirectly, some through what are called ESG ratings, environment, social, and governance ratings. about the quality of an investment, but there's no operational integration of earth science data into financial data. If we were to be able to do that, we would be able to show that the better investment is the one that actually builds value throughout natural systems, throughout human society, and for the betterment of all. Because as an investor, you don't just get the bang for your buck from the one entity you invest in, but you get all of those improvements at the same time. That's something I think we are working towards, but we have to work towards it as a civilization. Now, this is an image of Manhattan late last year. It's an incredibly dense place. It's been built to be that way. There's nowhere else to go. It's an island, so it's going to keep getting more dense probably. But think about the amount of resources that are required to sustain this place. And then think about what it feels like to be there. Being there, it feels like it is the center of the universe, like there's no other place. There's so much happening all in one place, the concentrated energy of it. I want to contrast that image with this one, which shows the same buildings from another perspective. Across the water, all of those buildings in Manhattan are reduced to that little line across the horizon. And to me, this is not just sort of philosophical moment of inspiration. This is a reality we have to think about very seriously. The ocean, the atmosphere are far more powerful forces than all of the architecture in all of the cities of the world. We have done enough to disrupt them that we're going to have consequences. So we have to figure out how to build resilience against all of that. This is why I think we can advocate for specific legislation. We can go and talk to government. We can change the light bulbs we use, and we can buy clean energy. We should do all those things. We also have to make sure we are transforming the systems that we live in. And so as a kind of roadmap for how we might start building an integrative geopolitics that recognizes that these are security issues. These are human security, national security, and geopolitical security issues. These are 5 areas where if we keep in mind that we'll have a better world if we're doing things like this, then we should start with these 5. So we need a price on pollution so we can negotiate the elimination of preventable harm. We shouldn't be polluting and killing people or making people weaker or more susceptible to respiratory diseases, for instance. And we shouldn't be destabilizing the climate because we wanted to turn on our computer. The right to know. All of us have a right to know whether something that we do or something that someone else does is going to be good for us or maybe dangerous. Right now, we live in a world where in theory, that right is protected, but in reality, it's rarely exercised and it's often not defended by governments. We need to make sure that the right to know is part of how we do everything. Use science to understand the interactions between human and natural systems and between systems themselves. Weave thinking. We need to have an awareness of that complexity and build it into the way we plan to build resilience. Reward activities that build resilience. We should think about decentralization because we can't have just a few people making decisions for everybody, even if they have the best science. It's not going to be as good if the number of sources are too limited. We need more diverse sources of information. We need as much cross-referencing as possible. We need to share information with people, including people we tend to think don't have use for it. Everybody has use for information. And we need to think about planetary health. We need to shift the way we make and distribute and consume food because it has such a huge impact on the way our activities impact the world. And I'll just leave it there for now and say thank you for having me as a keynote speaker, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Great, Joe, thank you very much for the talk. And I encourage everyone to please, if you have questions, to type it either in the Q&A box or the chat area. And we have a few to start with, Joe. So the first question is from Dork Sahajian, one of our professors here in the Environmental Studies program at Lehigh University in our EES department. At this moment, someone apparently would pay me to take oil off their hands. How might we promote the development of sustainable energy sources under these conditions?
Well, I certainly appreciate that question. I think it's an important question. The way I think about it is this resource has descended into negative pricing territory because it's not designed to have value in the circumstance we're in. And yet we're in a circumstance where all human needs continue to exist just as they did before. So we need to actually move to, I think, a world where we're valuing how well we serve need, how well we create value for everyone. There's a term that I really like, and I think the use of this term can do a lot of good, but it's complex. It's macro-critical resilience. And what that means is you can't not be resilient on things that shape the overall potential of society. So for instance, a few years back, Christine Lagarde, when she was head of the IMF, gave a speech in Lima, Peru, where she talked about how important this was and said that if you have two countries that are, in many ways similar, but one of the two countries gravely mistreats young girls when they try to go to school and the other one gives them a free public education, one thing you know about those two countries is that the one that mistreats young girls is far more likely to descend into civil war. In fact, that indicator is possibly the leading indicator of that eventual crisis. And so if it gives you budget numbers or economic projections, you know they can't be sustained. And that same thinking can apply to environmental impacts, public health impacts. It can apply to the diversity of opportunity open to everyone. It can apply to things like the wealth gap. If new income is going to too few people and the wealth gap is widening, a society is becoming less resilient. I think we use that insight to draw the difference between the world where oil was the blood of civilization and where we moved to something else where electricity and information are.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joe. The next question we have is, how do you think this pandemic will affect CO2 emissions?
I have no way to know, but certainly they've gone down quite a bit. CO2 emissions have declined across the world. Many of us have seen those images from New Delhi, which is notoriously one of the most polluted cities in the world in terms of air pollution, where you can now see blue sky. That's not likely to last, of course. Eventually, we'll turn things back on and you'll have pollution revving up again. But I think that we don't have to, treat anyone in that whole discussion as being responsible for bad things. We can simply look at the economics of what's happening. And what's happening in the current situation is that there are industries that have huge growth potential that can deliver energy to 1 billion people who need it, who've never had it, and to the rest of us safely and cleanly. And I think it's natural that new investments are going to go into the places where more innovation is happening. So my expectation is it's going to be harder to turn everything back on and go back to where we just have more and more pollution every year. I think that trend might actually stop, but we still have to make all the right choices.
Great, thanks. Here's a question. First, hi Joe, thank you for your presentation. In one of your slides showing the 17 goals, and I believe this is the UN goals, one of them is life below water, and another one is life on land. Could you elaborate on these two, please?
Sure. Actually, I'm glad for that question because so we often think about life below water as, let's protect fish, and life on land, let's protect ecosystems. And then we think about the industries that are at odds with that, right? There are certain industries that use the ocean that don't want us to be creating marine protected areas. And there are certain industries that use land that don't want us to set land aside for conservation. But that's not the real power of those two goals, to somehow win that fight or settle that fight. The power of those two goals is how they interact, actually, because, you know, you look at the Earth on a clear day and you know, there are some clouds, but you see blue, you see green, you see dry land, browner land, but everything that happens on land flows down to the sea. And so if we can build a society on land where our activities are more resilient, where we don't pollute as much, where we manage runoff, where we have watershed resilience plans for limiting pollution across entire watersheds, so the Des Moines Water Works doesn't have to sue farming communities for polluting the drinking water and raising the cost of cleaning it. If we can do that, for example, think about the headwaters of the Yellowstone River up in Montana, down into the Missouri River, into the Mississippi, that entire watershed that encompasses nearly half the United States. If we had a watershed-wide resilience strategy, we'd be protecting the ocean. And I think looking for those integrations and finding ways to invest intelligently in things that build mutual reciprocal value for upstream and downstream actors, that to me is where you see the power of the interaction of those two goals.
Great, thanks. The next question. As sustainability moves to the back of the minds of companies and government in favor of the pandemic and the economy, what do you recommend for students graduating during this crisis, hoping to pursue a career promoting sustainability and climate action?
Well, I would say this. I would say if you have been focusing on some of these things in your studies and you want to go out in the world and work on these things, I think there are going to be more and more job opportunities for resilience thinking, for environmental policy, for earth systems monitoring, for environmental assessments. But also, I think, and you might have gathered from the way that I presented this and from the integrative word in the title, multidisciplinary thinking, I think, is going to be one of the highest valued skills in the 21st century. So we often talked in previous eras about specialization versus being a generalist. And the idea of being a generalist was that you're a jack of all trades and a master of none, and there's a disadvantage to that. But I think that's a different discussion altogether than the one we're emerging into, where if you can operate comfortably in a multidisciplinary, complex challenge environment, where you can critically think your way through real existential threats, and you can find ways to build systems that are designed to deal with those threats by avoiding them. That type of multidisciplinary thinking is going to become part of almost everything. It's already become part of farming, even in very small communities. It's become part of infrastructure development in cities large and small. It's becoming part of diplomacy. You don't just put on your ocean hat in one room and put on your biodiversity hat in another room and put on your peace and security hat in another room. You now have to start having this multidisciplinary consciousness. I would say the opportunities are going to be there. Think about the way that you can work across sectors or across fields of expertise, and make sure that you spend time developing that multidisciplinary mind.
Great, thanks. This next question is, are we regressing as a society due to the COVID-19 pandemic? For example, there's been an increase in the use of single-use products, and they are discarded improperly, which could be a potential environmental hazard.
So that's an interesting question. I think, you know, let's say before COVID-19, we had made a lot of progress on eliminating single-use plastic in a lot of circumstances, and there's still efforts to find ways to do that. I don't think the fact that we're trying to use single-use plastics to deal with the public health threat of a pandemic means we are regressing. It does mean that that particular trend will be different. But it might also mean that the way we deal with the threat of single-use plastic will be different. So we clearly need to be more intelligent about managing pandemic preparedness and response. We also need to be more intelligent about managing the movement of plastic through our society. We probably can't eliminate it because it has a lot of value as a material. It does things other materials don't do. So are there ways we can use plastic where we're not going to be pushing tons and tons of plastic every minute into the ocean? There may be, but we haven't found them yet. And the ones we've tried haven't really worked all that effectively. So we started eliminating it. I think eliminating single-use plastic in the way we have been doing it, bags in grocery stores, that kind of thing, is good. Packaging, that's good. But in the case of, you know, medical protective needs, I think that's an area where we just have to figure out what the best strategy is. We don't have to, I don't think we're moving backwards because we're doing that.
Great, thanks. Next question. Is there a better metric than the Dow Jones to indicate the resilience of the economy?
There are many. You know, the Dow Jones Industrial Average looks at 30 of the wealthiest stocks. So it gives you a sense of the buoyancy of highly valued stocks on top of the waves of the stock market. But the stock market doesn't necessarily track with the health of the economy. Sometimes they're very different from each other. One goes up while the other, you know, struggles. I think we need to have a much better sense of what's happening on Main Street and in homes. You know, are people able to feed themselves? You know, there are metrics for that. Like there's the Human Development Index. There are, you know, I think the Weave graph that I showed before is designed to create a number of different indices that would be based on the sharing of knowledge. There are ways of looking at not the unemployment level, for instance, but the total amount of employment across the population mapped to the distribution of wealth, eliminating the top 1% and the bottom 1% so that we can figure out how most people are actually doing. Those kind of exercises, whether they're officially a metric or not, at this point, I think are going to be much more important than the Dow Jones for the next century, for sure. Thanks.
And I think we have time for one more question. We've got a lot of good ones. This is tough to select another one. So there is some indication that coronavirus came from wildlife. As we decrease the area of animal habitat, especially in the tropics, forcing more animals into populated areas, it has been suggested that human-wildlife contact is increased, promoting virus transfer, as was apparent with Ebola. So the same thing, land use for agriculture, that contributes to climate change also exacerbates viral transfer. There is doubly positive feedback in that human population explosion leads to both increased land use for agriculture and greater population density and thus transmission. How might we avoid this runaway feedback rooted in human population and food consumption? Is just becoming vegetarian sufficient globally?
That's a great question. Every element of that question is, I think, very useful for people to think about. So the double risk is an important part of that question, right? There's the proximity of people and wildlife, and then there's the density of human settlements. And so obviously, we can't necessarily make it so that human settlements are less dense. It's going to be difficult for us to do that if we also need land to produce food and we need to protect habitat. So the density is one we have to manage within its own, I think, constraints. In fact, we may need more density in some ways to have a more sustainable society. I think that the clearest place we have to go is in how we use land. We can't be treating productive land as if it's just space. We have to be treating it as what it is, which is a living system. right? Productive land is a living system. What makes land more fertile than other land is the quantity of life and nutrients that are there, along with water and a positive sort of stable climate system in that region. Those are the things that make it so that we can produce food. And so if we treat the food growing areas of the world as living systems, and then we try to value them in that way, value the richness of ecology for what it is, which is a source of richness that underlies all other value. We can value carbon in the soil, for instance, and create a higher value for sustainable farming. We can incentivize more labor intensive, which also means better for people to increase incomes, practices in terms of regenerative farming and land use practices. We can try to keep people who produce food and people who build cities away from sensitive habitat. And we can try to, as best we can, determine where are the human nature interactions that are part of our existing system. And so there is less risk in enhancing those interactions, and try to identify the ones where we're all better off leaving the wild wild and leaving humanity to its own spaces. If we can do all those things and use land more effectively, grow food more sustainably, I think we have a much better chance of reducing these ramifications of our unsustainable practices.
Joe, thanks so much. We're out of time. And so in closing, on behalf of Lehigh University, thank you so much for being our keynote speaker on our 50th anniversary of Earth Day.
Thank you so much, Al. It was a great pleasure.